Hello and welcome to this video. In this video we're going to look into a deep dive on bank rules.
Cause I can get him out of my head.
Hello, my name's Patrick. I'm a chartered accountant and certified UK trainer for QuickBooks. In this video we're going to take a real deep dive into bank rules. We're going to be looking at you as a business owner or an accountant, and we're going to see how bank rules can be really useful and make your life easier. And the best thing about QuickBooks is all about making it efficient and making sure that we use the features involved in QuickBooks to speed up your process of getting your information into QuickBooks. And one of those ways in which you can really make some great savings in terms of time and efficiency is by utilizing rules properly. Rules is a really good feature within QuickBooks, and we're going to have a look at it, deep dive into it, and see how we can use it to the best of our ability. Okay, so enough about this. Let's have a look at QuickBooks itself, look at rules, and see how we can use it. Okay, first of all, let's talk about where rules are held and what they're useful for. So it's all about the banking section of QuickBooks. I'm going to jump into a banking section. Now, one thing you might notice differently about this particular look and feel of my bank here, one thing you might notice about this layout here is that I've already set up a load of rules. And as I scroll down through these transactions, you'll notice that a lot of these items have got green elements next to them, indicating that QuickBooks knows what to do with them. The more green items I have in QuickBooks means I can quickly and efficiently put those transactions into QuickBooks. As an example, let's go through and use this recognize button here. When I do that recognize button, it's going to show me all the transactions that QuickBooks know about. And I can use that batch actions button we learned out in the last banking episode, and I can press accept selected. So I ticked all my items, batch actions, accept selected. What that's going to do is it's going to match all those transactions for me that already put rules against it, leaving me with 10 items left. And even in these 10 items, there's a few more rules that I can pick out as well. I'm going to go through and add these ones. Within that 10 seconds or so of going into my bank account, I'm now left with 5 transactions. And these 5 transactions are transactions I would consider as complex transactions. And these ones we would look at in a little bit more detail. And we want to spend a bit of more time with these transactions to make sure we deal with them right. And we've got to think about them in a particular way. And in another video, I'm going to go through how we would deal with these sort of transactions. But today, let's concentrate on how I got to this position where I got rid of all the quote-unquote noise, and I'm now left with just the complex transactions. And that's one of the reasons rules can be really, really useful. The other part about rules that's really useful is the ability for you as an accountant or someone who's overlooking a set of bookkeeping, is gives you the ability to set how particular transactions are dealt with. And if you think about it, if you've got a really complex VAT issue, or you've got a particular transaction that is really imperative that it gets dealt with in a certain way, then applying a rule to it first means that whoever does the bookkeeping, they won't have that issue. They won't even see that transaction in some instances. That one will just get dealt with completely how you want it to be dealt with. So they're the two main benefits of rules. A, speeding things up like we've got here, and B, making sure that transactions are dealt with in a particular way. So let's explore rules in a little bit more detail. Before that, I'm going to bring all my transactions back again so that we can deal with them in a case-by-case scenario. Okay, so where are rules held? Top up here, we've got the rules section just on the right of the banking tab. And in here it gives you a list of the rules that I've got. Now, as I said before, this is a client where I've already put in a load of rules there, so I've got loads of rules already set out. Now there are 3 ways to create a rule from scratch, but what I want to look at this moment in time is how we can create one completely from scratch using this page here. Now, when I'm creating a rule, I like to have either 2 screens set up independently, or at least have both screens on show. So let's have a look at that. So in this view here, on the left hand side I've got a bank account, on the right hand side I've got another bank account, and on this right hand side I'm going to deal with the rules. I'm going to make this one a little bit smaller. And the reason I would suggest looking at this means that you've got a way of referencing that original transaction. And with rules, one of the things to bear in mind is A, make sure you know what that original transaction is, make sure you know the details relating to it, and B, don't be afraid of trial and error. Trial and error using rules is one of the best ways to get confident with rule creating, and also best way to make sure that you can troubleshoot any rules that you already have. So in this one then, I'm going to look for a transaction that doesn't have a rule. So down the bottom here, I've got quite a few. And what I'm going to do is say, going forward, every time I see funds transfer, I want it to be dealt with in a particular way. Now to do that, on my rules area, I've now got the transaction here and I can click into it to see a little bit more detail. So by looks of it, it's a funds transfer to the USD account. In fact, there it is, funds transferred $4,000. So going forward, I want to make sure. Now, the complexity around multi-currency and everything else we'll deal with in another video, but let's figure out how we would create a rule that every time funds transfer comes in, we can deal with it accordingly. So to do that, I'm going to go to my rules page, and I'm going to use this feature at the top here called New Rule. From New Rule, the first thing it needs is a rule name. Just like most things within QuickBooks, that name has to be unique. So in this one, I'm going to call it Funds Transfer. When you do create the name, you then need to decide where this rule is going to apply. So is it money out, money in, and which bank account? Notice you can select all if needed. And then the next area is talking about the conditions. So this is this section just here. Now, when you're dealing with conditions, thinking about it as in you're trying to say to the rule, at what point do I want this rule to work? So in this case, when a condition, you have the option to do all or any. So maybe you want a condition where you want all of these conditions to be met, and you can keep adding lines and adding multiple conditions if you need to, or maybe it's with any. Now, all is when you've got a particular transaction that you're trying to get. So maybe it's going to be every time that you have a new asset from PC World and it's above £100, you want it to be dealt with as a fixed asset. But if it's below £100, you want it to be dealt with as computer expenses. And that's where that can be really useful, and that's where the all comes in. Any is when you go in, every time I see a particular transaction, I want to deal with it in the same way. And you might have multiple suppliers for that transaction, or you might have multiple events that come to that particular transaction. So any gives you the opportunity. So an example, if I had delivery charges or something like that, then every time I see post office or DPD or Hermes or anything like that, I would want to deal with it in the same way. And you can put each of those different suppliers in there, so every time one of those appear, it will be dealt with. In this case, we're going to keep it really simple. When a transaction meets all, we're only going to have one there, so we'll just have all for now. And on the left hand side, I can find out what it's going to be. So in this case, it's my description, funds transfer, because it's just here, look. So I can even copy that one, and I can paste that one. So I'm keeping this condition really easy. I'm saying that when a transaction meets description contains fund transfer. Now your other variables in there are quite simple. If I add another line, we can have a look at that. We can have bank text or description. Now description is this element here, the small amount, but as you can see from this idea, bank detail, which is bank text, gives you more information. So you have the opportunity to have description, which is the really short and simple description, or it's going to be bank detail or bank text, which goes into a lot more detail. And sometimes you need to have a look at that bank text to be able to understand it. A good example of that is from a HMRC point of view. Doesn't matter if you're paying VAT or self-employed or corporation tax, the description will always say HMRC, but the bank text may give you an indication of if it was VAT, corporation tax, or self-employed. So that's a really good use of bank text. You also have the opportunity to look at amounts, and then when you look at amounts, you can put the amount there, and then here is a little modifier here. So you've got equals, is greater than, is less than, or doesn't equal. And for description, you've got contains, is exactly, or doesn't contain. Giving you loads of variables there to be able to make sure you create the perfect rule. So that's condition. The next section is thinking about what to do with the transaction. And think of this to be very similar to if I was posting on this left hand side. I'd be asked the same questions. I'll be asked if this was an sales receipt, for example. It's going to ask me what type of tax code and everything else that it relates to. Now with this one thing to note is this is particularly money in, so let's put that in first. And from here, I get to say what type of transaction it is. So here I'm going to have deposit, credit card, sales receipt, or transfer. I'm going to have transfer on this particular one. And from an account point of view, I'm going to go say to my USD current account. Now, when you've done that and you've got that automatically set up, you have the opportunity here to put a memo if you need to. And then you have the opportunity normally with transactions to auto categorize and auto add, or auto categorize and manually review. Now the reason that we have these two options is to take it away from this review area on the left hand side. If I auto categorize and manually review as it's got shown now, then the rule will still appear here just like these rules have just here, and then I have to actually still go in and manually say yes, I'm happy for them to go in, and I'd have to use the add button, or as I did at the beginning of the video, batch actions and add all. The other use of that is auto categorize and auto add, which is just here. What that will do is it will never appear on the full review page. As soon as that transaction hits, it will automatically get added into QuickBooks, which could be a really key time saver for you going forward. You can imagine that once we've got if we had all of our transactions auto categorize and auto add, then we're going to quickly add transactions. But one tip I would always say is before you auto categorize and auto add, is auto categorize and manually review. Make sure that rule is working as intended, and then when we're happy with it, you can go back to the rules list, edit it, and then move it to auto categorize. Now we've saved the rule. We're now going to go through looking at our bank, find that transaction, and you'll see that funds transfer now has a new rule associated with it. If I ever want to look into a little bit more detail, I can click on the rule itself, and then it lets me go through from there. So that's a quick look at creating a rule. Now I mentioned there was more than one way in which you can create rules within QuickBooks. So let's go back to our banking screen. Let's find one of those transactions that doesn't have a rule associated with them. The other way in which you can create rules is by the transaction itself. Now the way that this works and be useful for you is that you don't have to go through all that manual process we just did on the first rule. So as an example here, American halves, I can open that transaction and I can create rule from the transaction here. When I use this button, it takes me back to that rule page, but it brings in American halves and the amount as well. So that's a quick way of being able to create rules. The third and final way to create a rule is QuickBooks prompting you. So in this case, I've got two transactions here. Now, if I try and add two transactions at the same time, QuickBooks is going to prompt you to say, oh, actually, why don't you create a rule for that to make it easier for you? So let's see how that works. So I'm going to jump into PC World. I'm happy printing, posting, and stationery is there. Let's just put a tax code so it's nice and consistent. And then I'm going to press add. Now that's my first transaction. And as always, it's now going to learn that every time it sees PC World, it's going to remember printing, posting, and stationery. But then if I go to add the next transaction, what will happen is it will come up with suggested rule. So what it's saying is because you're doing that on a consistent basis, to save time, why don't you create a rule regarding it? So it's going to create exactly the same rule we've just looked at in the same manner, should I say. But it also gives the opportunity to auto add. So in this case, if every time I see PC World, I want it to always be printing, postage and stationery, I can press the auto add button. That means every time a PC World appears in the bank account, it'll automatically add that transaction for me. And just press create rule. And just like the rules we looked at on the other account, it's now created a suggested rule for me, description PC World, category there, and the only thing I would probably add in there is putting a tax code as well. Okay, so that's creating a rule. Let's look at some use cases for when rules can be really useful. The first one, as we've already seen, was that ability to be able to go through and add all these transactions en masse. And you could go that one step further and you could put auto categorize and auto add on each and every one so that every time it hits the bank account, they're automatically added for you. The other bit that can be useful though is if you've got a really complex transaction. So when I put in description order, I noticed I've got 4 streamline charges there. Now the important thing to note about this one is that the rule being applied, so let's have a look at the rule applied streamline charges. With streamline, I've got to be careful because I have 2 different elements to it. I've got the rental element of renting an EPOS system, so this is me buying a credit card machine. So there's the rental of that credit card and then there's the charges on top. Now the rental element is consistent every time there's charges is, but the actual charges themselves are going to be different each and every time. You can see that on all 4 of them. So if I look at this rule applied in a little bit more detail, this is the second place where rules can be really useful. So on here, I would be a little bit nervous of letting my client do this because they may not understand the difference between the 2 of them, especially in this case where there's VAT differences as well. So here, I've got bank text contains streamline. So that's me as a condition saying that if it sees streamline, do this. And then when it says what I want to do with it, this is where you can be really clever with rules. So what I've done is said the first £42.50 I want as equipment rental at 20%. But the key is that the remainder amount, the amount that will always change, is going to be exempt and go against credit card charges. I would probably want to even auto categorize and auto add this so that if my client's doing this by themselves, they're not going to accidentally see that transaction and try and put it somewhere else. I want every time streamline charges come in, I want this way to be done because then I'm confident that it's going to go right in terms of making sure that the equipment rental and the credit card charges and the VAT element are all dealt with correctly. The next thing that we want to look at is a bit of a pro tip here, and that's how you can really make rules work well for you if you've got lots and lots of clients. And the example of this, if I jump into rules up here, you'll notice I've got all these rules here, including ones like telephone charges. Now during this telephone charges rule, if I press edit on that one, during the telephone charges rule, it's given me an option of, or it's looking for these following conditions. So if it sees BT, EE, Vodafone, O2 or Free, then it's going to post against telephone accordingly. Now this particular client may only use BT or Vodafone, but the reason that I'm showing this one is because of my pro tip. When you're in the new rules section, you have the opportunity in the new rules section to press the downward arrow. And when you press the downward arrow, you get to choose between exporting and importing rules. So what I've started to do is for all my clients is I have a list of generic rules that I import every time I take on that client on. And those generic rules are going to be things like telephone charges. They're going to be ones where you know it's going to happen each and every time that you take on a client. So why not standardize the way that that works and import those rules every time you take on a client. So you're not having to create this rule list each and every time. Doing that is going to save you a lot of time and it's going to make you much more efficient when it comes to looking after your clients. Okay, so that was a nice look into rules for us. As you can see, there's loads of ways in which you can make rules work really well for you and your clients. Now, rules themselves can either be designed to speed up your processing of your accounts. So for me, I have a lot of auto add-in transactions. I have a couple of clients where every time I log into them, 90% of their transactions are completely dealt with. And for me, when I log in, I've only ever got a couple of transactions to ever deal with. And that's really good for me because they're the transactions that they need my assistance on. They're going to need me to understand how to deal with them because they could be a more complex transaction to deal with completely. So that's putting rules into play. Remember, you can import and export them. And then also remember that for a complex transaction, a good rule can make sure that your client deals with it consistently, and it makes sure that you can make it so set up for your own business that those complex transactions are always dealt with accordingly. And that's it. That's a nice rundown of rules within QuickBooks. Join us on the next video where we're going to look at some more ways in which we can save time, make the best out of QuickBooks, and don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you in the next video. Bye for now.
I say yeah. I told him I can be a fighter if you want. I'll be there to catch you if you fall. I can make it brighter when it's dark, I told him I would do it all for you, and I know you do it for me too. I can be a fighter if you want. I can be a fighter. I can be a fighter if you want. I can be a fighter if you want. All the way that I feel, yeah, I know that it's real, 'cause I can get him out of my head. I don't care what we do, everything's feeling new. Even if we stay in bed, my heart is saying yeah.